So Net Balance is a sustainability business. We practice sustainability ourselves, and as you can see from material around, we work on sustainability, climate change, environment, economics, and social responsibility. So we have a fairly broad range of things that we are working in. And I see from this particular event, Thriving Beyond Economic Growth, here today, and I guess whether you regard the change in feeling as being a secular change in the underlying, I guess, basis of business as it develops, or something which is a response to the GFC, a response to the rampant consumerism of the last 10 to 15 years, a process of aggressive deleveraging, whether it's through deleveraging carbon or debt. There is, I think, a trend which we're generally seeing to understand that there are in fact limits to growth, and that rampant growth maybe isn't the best thing to be doing. Maybe it should be just a more steady growth. There have been some other events that we've had here and are having in other places also. A little while ago here we had the upside of down, the end of growth. Richard Heinberg, Paul Gilding, and one of our own personnel, Eva Nitzer. And in a couple of weeks in Melbourne, another forum, again looking at growth and social responsibility, basically looking at shared value. So this is something which is becoming far more prevalent in the Australian community, and I think globally as well. And so I welcome Donnie McClurkin. A
very quick intro to Donnie before he takes the floor. So tonight is What If? Thriving Beyond Economic Growth. What if, over the next 40 years, economies around the world could transition to futures beyond economic growth, while simultaneously increasing happiness, access to essential services and human innovation? A little bit on Donnie. Donnie is the co-founder of the Post-Growth Institute, an international group exploring and inspiring paths to global prosperity that don't rely on economic growth. He is also the founder and ideas guy to Project Australia, a community organisation helping people start, scale and sustain not-for-profit initiatives. He's passionate about innovative yet simple approaches to social change and likes to build on what is already working, whilst retaining a critical lens by which to make such observations. He's recently written a book, he's also written other books, titled Nanotechnology and Global Equality, and co-edited Nanotechnology and Global Sustainability. He is a global convener of Free Money Day, which I also took part in last month. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, Distinguished Fellow with the UK Schumacher Institute, thank you, for Sustainable Systems, and best known as that guy who ran across Australia for the Fred Hollows Foundation, for whom he's still an ambassador. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Donnie.
About 3 years ago, I was sitting in the back of an audience at a conference up in the Brisbane Convention Centre, and a gentleman, Colin Saltbeer, got up on stage and started to tell his story. It was a story about his company called Myuma. They work in civil and construction engineering. They employ about 50 people. They have a turnover of around $17 million a year, and they're not for profit. And I sat there as he said those words, not for profit, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was a foreign concept to me, so I went up afterwards and had a chat with him and said, "What do you mean you're not for profit?" He said, "Well, we're a bunch of Aboriginal blokes who got together, decided we wanted to do something, limit our own incomes, redistribute any of the profits that we make from the work that we're doing back into the good work in the community or into our own business, and we understood the politics of enough." And what that set off for me on that very day, 3 years ago, was a journey that's led me here tonight, where I managed to explore, and I'm still exploring, in fact probably at the beginning of my exploration, of the not-for-profit model. And I discovered some wonderful things. So for example, a couple of years ago in Victoria, there was the launch of Australia's first not-for-profit electrical service called GBE Electrical, that's now expanded and is doing very well providing electricians within a not-for-profit framework. Many of you would know of Good Start, the one that took over from ABC Learning here in Australia in terms of the provision of childcare services, that's set up as a not-for-profit. And interestingly, as they did that, they found their occupancy rates actually increased compared to ABC Learning, largely because, in terms of the survey they got, the feedback they got back through surveys, because of their mission-driven focus. You've got Dane Murray, for example, who's sitting in our audience tonight, who actually runs an eco toothbrushes services called Green Teeth, setting that up at the moment, a delivery service for toothbrushes through subscription as a not-for-profit. All sorts of things that fit within this not-for-profit model, but actually run as enterprises. And then you move right up to the other end of the spectrum, to the big end of town, and you've got BRAC, the world's biggest not-for-profit. Employs 120,000 people in the healthcare, education and microfinance provision services area. Touches over 100 million people across many continents. And yet it's not-for-profit, and 80% of its funding comes through its own commercial enterprises. They run a dairy, they run a food company, they also run a chain of retail handicraft stores around the place. 80% of this major multinational company, 80% of the funding comes from social enterprise, from commercial enterprise, within the not-for-profit framework. My story begins, though, at the other end of the spectrum, in the for-profit space. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, and my younger brother was 2 or 3 years old, I was the ringmaster. I was the one who would organise the circus performances for the local neighbours. I'd get people in and I'd charge them for a seat, and we'd put on the shows with the hula hoops and our little dog Poppy. And that was the beginning of my entrepreneurial streak. Then I discovered my brother was quite good at art, incredibly good in fact. So I exploited that for the next 3 or 4 years, made him produce a whole lot of artworks. We had plenty of art shows. And then I was just reading through looking through some of my old papers the other day, and I found the first business that I set up. It was an ironing business when I was 10 years of age. Donald and James McClurkin are starting up an organisation. Note I was actually already in the organisational framework. I, Donald, have a cheap price deal, 15 cents for shirts, 10 cents for shorts, 20 cents for trousers, all other things 5 cents. Please tick the box on the survey. This was our second customer, actually, Deirdre Trayett, who signed up for every 2 weeks. And that was actually quite a good little business for a little while there. I loved ironing. My brother used to do the folding, and he did the delivery service as well. And so I was really into this sort of stuff, and because I came from a wealthy family, but we were cash poor, asset rich, owned a big home on Sydney's North Shore, but didn't have much money when it came down to actually weekly allowances and the like. No pocket money, none of those sorts of things. So very much a business ethic model. Go out and earn it for yourself. You want a pair of trousers? Earn the money to pay for it yourself. And so I did. I went through from working for $2.50 an hour, 10 hours a week as a 12-year-old, which probably wasn't legal, at the local fruit shop. Then I went on to the chemist delivery run for $5 an hour, into the bookshop for a couple of years as well. Then I went, as an 18-year-old, I was at $4 an hour for the newspaper delivery service until I got a $96 fine for speeding or not wearing a helmet on my push bike on the way back at 6:30 in the morning. So I left that job. And I was also interested in the share market at this point. At age, what would it have been? Age 12 here, I looked over this note. I purchased 80 shares in Westpac at $4.50 for a total of $243. This was the signatory note from the person who sold me the shares. So I was fascinated by this sort of stuff. I kept a balance sheet of all sorts of things and really kept on top of this stuff as much as I could. And it was interesting looking back into my year 10, you know those tests they do with you to work out what profession would be ideal for what you should, what suits your character type. Well, it said here, you are interested, this is in the strong light category, you're interested in organising and managing the economic, accounting and financial areas of business. Giving advice about stocks and shares, finance and investment appeals to you. You should consider work involving the application of maths and statistics to economic problems, analysing economic and business trends and making forecasts about these. And then it said a second thing that I have a strong like of. You are attracted to this type of work which involves a high level of skill in verbal or written communication. You enjoy writing books and articles, reviewing and criticising or cataloguing documents, giving talks and lectures appeal to you. So for once in the world, smack bang on. But it didn't come around that way, because whilst all my friends pretty much went off to investment banks or into the legal profession, I went and did sports science. I followed my heart and became an exercise physiologist. And I worked with Sydney's homeless, and I worked on the telephones as a telephone counsellor with Lifeline. And something came back to me as I was having those experiences with those groups, because what I kept finding on the telephones, for example, with Lifeline, were ex-CEOs calling up saying that they were in serious trouble. Or the time that I was working on the streets and a guy came up to me and said, he was my age, 23, 24 at the time, that he'd been staying in Waverley Park for 9 months. And I asked him to share his story with me, and he did. And he'd been kicked out of Sydney University for hacking. A brilliant mind. His parents had disowned him. He developed an addiction to drugs. And 4 years earlier, he'd been the Ducks of Sydney Grammar. And to me, that was just shocking, that we're living in a society where all sorts of people with very high-level skills, let alone all the people generally who were struggling with the system, but that we were letting certain people like this fall through the cracks, blew me away, because I thought, how could we even get to that point without realising it? And it took me back, as I was having these experiences, to something that happened when I was about 13 or 14 years of age, in my very money-hungry phase. I used to love going around to the throwouts, the local curbside collections, and seeing what I could find. Came up with all sorts of things. That was back in the day when there were Sony Walkmans, if you remember those. And I picked up one of those once that lasted for about 6 years. And the day, a few weeks after that Sony Walkman experience, I found $14 worth of money being thrown out in a throwout. It was a US coinage. And that is something that I've never forgotten. It really put an interesting spin on the whole throwaway society kind of thing. And that, and combined with some international travel I did at the time, then led me probably, with the Fred Hollows Foundation work and other things, into international development. And I did my PhD studies looking at nanotechnology and its global implications. And the conclusions that I had there were around the need to innovate without economic growth, as we're going to talk about a little tonight. But throughout this process as well, things were changing in Australia. There was quite a lot of discontent around the stifling of conversation in the political realm, and there was particularly a lot of sense when I was having dinner parties and having people around that people wanted to do something in the community. They wanted to get back into community work. And so I looked to set up a national nights of discussion around what people wanted to do, what kind of Australia they wanted, and out of that came this organisation, Project Australia, that helps people start, scale and sustain community projects. And so for the last 7 years of working with that organisation, I've got to glimpse the not-for-profit landscape in Australia, how it's changing and the potential that's there. And the biggest learnings I've had in engaging with not-for-profits are probably 3 things. Firstly, that not-for-profit is misunderstood. Secondly, that not-for-profit is underestimated. And thirdly, that not-for-profits are generally underperforming. Now, in terms of misunderstood, no matter where I am in the world, when I say the word not-for-profit, what people usually think of, in my experience, is no profit, can't make profit, bureaucratic, these sorts of things. Very different dynamics, having just returned from the US and the way that people treat not-for-profit there, or non-profit as it's often called, to Australia and to other parts of the world. But generally there's that association that not-for-profit doesn't have a business model. But really, not-for-profit in a legal sense actually just means not for private profit, or not for the primary purpose of making profit. As highlighted by those examples at the beginning, not-for-profits can make as much money as they want. It's just that they can't invest any of that money or redistribute any of that money to individuals, to shareholders, to private equity, etc. That's the fundamental difference that lots of people don't take into mind. They can make plenty of money as long as it goes back into the avenues that are outlined in the Constitution, in the objects of the Constitution. And if they wind up, then they have to have a clause about what happens then as well. And that can't be money being distributed to individuals. Not-for-profits are particularly underestimated, not just in Australia, around the world. Few people know, for example, that the not-for-profit sector contributes $43 billion annually to Australia's GDP. That's 2/3 of the retail sector. in terms of GDP. Not-for-profits contribute money to the economy, and that's because lots of things from your Smith family or your St Vincent de Paul thrift shops are making money, and that money is going back through the not-for-profit mechanisms into services. And not-for-profit are particularly underestimated in terms of the potential that is there, in terms of the power of the not-for-profit model. So, and this is where we're at a particularly unique period in history. 15, 20 years ago, pre-internet age in terms of mass usage, if I wanted to set up any kind of business, let's say I wanted to set up a professional speakers bureau like the one that Project Australia is setting up. If I wanted to set up a professional speakers bureau, I'd certainly need a certain amount of startup capital to do that, because I'd need my admin budget, I'd need my marketing budget, I'd need all sorts of things that cost money back 20 years ago. The digital era changes the game. Entry costs have changed, and I've seen this as well in the nanotechnology space, where people are doing poor man's nanotechnology, high quality research in places like Thailand at the Asian Institute of Technology, where they're coming in with very low costs for startup because the digital era changes things. Knowledge has opened up. I can now, for example, employ someone for $5 through 5rr.com to actually do something really interesting, make a video, for example, to promote my work. Imagine the cost of making a video 20 years ago for a startup not-for-profit. Absolutely inhibitive for most startups. The game has changed, and with that, the situation changes interestingly. And not-for-profit is a really interesting thing too as a startup mechanism. Very few people understand in Australia that not-for-profits can operate businesses. And it's different here than in the US. In the US, you have to have that for tax purposes. If you want income tax exemption, your purpose of your business must be fully aligned within the not-for-profit's mission. In Australia, that's not presently the case. Now, call that a caveat or not, but at the moment, you can run a business like, for example, Meals on Wheels New South Wales has an insurance company called Crisp on the side that I think it's about $500,000 turnover. Now, insurance isn't the area that Meals on Wheels works in, yet that is one of the backbones of how they make their money and operate as a business, Meals on Wheels, providing those meals to people throughout New South Wales. So there are different things. The fact that in Australia, if you set up as a not-for-profit association, up to a certain point straight away, you get income tax exemption, you get GST exemption. Wouldn't we all love not to have to do BAS statements? Well, here's one person who never has to do one because I don't operate a not-for-profit that's bigger than $80,000 turnover per year. And even if I do push beyond those limits, then I can actually apply for income tax exemption status, which we recently got, in fact. So there's all sorts of abilities there. There's free software that you can access as a not-for-profit. There's obviously the social good aspect of being a not-for-profit and being able to advertise as such. There's all sorts of studies that have been done around worker motivation, about flattening of hierarchies within organisations, so from a hierarchical to a network model that's attributed more in the not-for-profit space. All sorts of things where we underestimate the power of not-for-profit. That said, not-for-profits largely underperform. Why? Because they're still stuck often with old board members, with people whose mindsets are still stuck pre-digital, and the thinking is still that certain things will cost a certain amount of money and that there's certain bureaucratic mechanisms that are required to run successful not-for-profits in the charity model. Very few people in Australia yet understand the power of social enterprise and running not-for-profits with an enterprise model, especially when it comes to avoiding the cyclical nature of funding cycles or crashes in terms of international crashes. So there's certainly some exciting potential there, I think, for companies, organisations to explore in terms of actually setting up as not-for-profits, and I'll be talking a little bit about that a little later on. So what is it that I'll be putting forward tonight? Well, my dream, and something that I believe will become a reality in some senses, inevitably, is for a not-for-profit world by 2050. A world in which every business has as its primary motivation the fulfilment of social needs. And what there I'm talking about is really a shift from quantitative growth to one of qualitative growth. A focus on basic needs stuff, a focus on community development that comes naturally with the not-for-profit space. And often when I talk about not-for-profits, people think, oh, well, you're just putting one big label out there and saying everything needs to be this, and that's pretty limiting. Well, in fact, within not-for-profit, there are many, many different kinds of avenues you can take in terms of business and legal structures. You've got your producer and consumer co-ops, for example. You've got social firms that employ largely people with disability. You've got associations, company limited by guarantee, charities, solidarity franchises, which are emerging in Europe, community land trusts, and various forms of community-supported initiatives, community-supported agriculture, for example. Lots of diversity within a legal structure. A legal structure that I would argue is actually smack bang on. Nothing more needed when it comes to sustainability. And the important thing here that I often have engagement around is, well, not-for-profit is telling us what something shouldn't be, rather than what it should be. And then we move often into that conversation around for-benefit corporations or shared value, etc., that I'll be touching on a little tonight. I think it's time, just like our international institute is called the Post-Growth Institute, rather than the Thrivability Institute. I think there comes an important time in history when you need to draw a line in the sand and say, you know what? If there's a model here that actually can be equated to sustainability and it exists already and it just requires innovation from within, how about we go with it? Because it's actually quite difficult to innovate new legal and business structures around the world. It's much easier to work within models that already exist. In terms of the inevitability of a not-for-profit world by 2050, certainly quite a radical statement to put out there. Now, I know Marx has written stuff about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I don't know Marx. I haven't read Marx. I don't have any formal economics training. It's something that I'll be looking into over the next 6 months as I write this book about not-for-profit. But what I do know is that Deloitte last year produced a report, quite a comprehensive report, that said this, and I quote, "By comparing net income and assets, we see that economy-wide profitability is significantly lower in 2010 than it was in 1965, referring to the US economy. My hypothesis associated with this is that for-profits will actually become uneconomic over the next 40 or 50 years. How come? They'll get squeezed out of the market by not-for-profits. How come? Because resource constraints and the power of the not-for-profit model will both coalesce to a point that profit margins will decrease to a position where for-profits just won't be able to continue operating, particularly if they have shareholders. And in the resource pressures space, the big one that we hear often about is peak oil. Now again, I'm not a peak oil expert, but what I know from listening to people like Richard Heinberg and others is that the quality of oil that is available to us and the ability for us to pump that out at an increasing rate is no longer there. And we know that oil is the lifeblood of the capitalist machinery. In fact, it's the lifeblood particularly of the for-profit machinery when it comes to production, etc., and distribution and logistics associated with distribution. And my guess is that if profit margins are already decreasing since 1965, as Deloitte says, that things are only going to get harder and harder, particularly given the amount of company debt, private debt, held in companies around the world and the bubbles associated with that. And peak oil surely is going to raise, just taking the next step, raise those costs in terms of operational costs to a point that I would say is too far. But here is an interesting thing about not-for-profits. You don't have to make as much, if any, profit to run a successful not-for-profit business. That's the wonderful thing. You can operate at steady state making the same amount of money as you pay in expenditure to staff salaries, to operational expenditures beyond staff salaries, etc., year on year on year, and perform your services, whilst even expanding if you're innovating within that model. And that's something that for-profits struggle to do. Now, in terms of market pressures, some interesting things are happening, particularly around the open business model and peer-to-peer production space. You see, the last 30 years has really been galvanised in the market around this notion of the privatisation of knowledge, the proprietary basis of knowledge, intellectual property, IP. That is about to change and is already changing whether or not for-profit businesses like it or not. The commons movement that's got kick-started by the open source software movement, the creation of Linux and others, are game changers in this space. And companies are starting to realise this. IBM realised this. They tried to actually train up 1,000 staff, I think this was back in the late 70s, in Linux because they saw how innovative an iterative model was for an operating system. They pulled across 1,000 people that they trained up and tried to run with them inside their business. It didn't work because the kernel was still over in terms of the development, was still over with Linux, and they were innovating faster over there with all the people around the world contributing to the code than they could within IBM. So now IBM builds their service models on top of the Linux model. And this is what's continually coming up. People like Michelle Bowens, who's just written the Synthetic Overview of Collaborative Economy, a massive report about what's going on in the peer-to-peer productions and commons space, are starting to show, is that it's now getting more and more conclusive that open business models are much more innovative than closed ones that engage with proprietized knowledge. Much more iterative, much more buy-in from users. You've got essentially the emergence of the reputation economy, which is a very interesting thing for business. One thing I find particularly interesting about it is if you have a not-for-profit open design project, which is building a washing machine, for example, versus a closed business model that's designing a washing machine. Which one is going to build built-in obsolescence? The for-profit one, right? Not-for-profits have absolutely no interest in built-in obsolescence. The opposite. And what's that going to mean in terms of market competitiveness over time? My guess is that one's going to be competitive and one isn't, as more and more people wake up to just how bloody annoying it is to have things breaking on them all the time. And what Charlie Ledbetter says as well is that behind that not-for-profit open innovation model, is the rise of what he calls the pro-ams. These are amateurs, hobbyists who come through and develop professional skills but don't operate in the professional space, in the paid space. And I'm sure people in the audience have experienced this, right? There are so many people now who are contributing as experts to Wikipedia, the people who are contributing to the maker movement. I know that there was a maker fair in San Francisco last year, I believe. 69,000 people tried to get there, massive traffic jam. So many people are starting to engage in this space where through open source design, where the design is available and you can learn yourself YouTube tutorials, etc., the knowledge is there to train yourself up and become essentially a professional as an amateur, pro-ams as Charlie Ledbetter calls it. And a great example of this open model while I'm talking about it is Wikispeed. I don't know too much about them, but I know they're the ones that use essentially a software model and apply it to the building of cars. They innovate cars every 7 or so days. They use, if you're familiar with software language, scrums, sprints, and they bring people in together and work on an iterative design model for actually building car models. And what they've found is, whereas it takes 24 years on average for a car model through Ford, etc., to actually be innovated, the Wikispeed model is innovating every 7 days to what people are wanting, etc. And it's got the ability for that agileness because of the way that it does design, because it's not caught up in an old, big, for-profit corporation structure that is limited by its very nature. Why does it matter that we shift to not-for-profit? Why does it matter that we make shifts at all in our business model? Well, for some people here, it's probably quite obvious in terms of the environmental things. But what I wanted to hone in on tonight was why I'm particularly talking about a business structure and legal model rather than environmental initiatives, energy efficiency, etc. It's because I believe that the primary cause of unsustainability is status envy that is created by financial inequity. And this is from travelling around the world and seeing not that people don't necessarily have the same amount of opportunities, etc., because they don't, but from talking to people who constantly in the global south are talking to me about aspirations, who they want to be like, and the model that's been sold to them for so long. And the interesting thing that comes here, I think, when you think about the sustainability space in relation to status envy, is that studies by Layard and others, and you've got Wilkinson and Pickett's book that came out, The Spirit Level, that goes into this sort of stuff, say that relative income has much more effect on subjective well-being than absolute well-being. Now that's interesting, because it says you could take someone, as is so commonly used in the development space, take someone out of poverty, lift them out of poverty, out of absolute poverty, and they move from one space into the rat race, where it then becomes a matter of relative poverty. I've just returned from the US, where there are 2 million young people living on the streets. And so the Western model of development, driven by the various aspects of capitalism, various different forms of capitalism, because there are many, puts forward that notion of opportunity, innovation, the profit motive as the best driver, trickle-down economics, all those things that we know about, yet doesn't take into account really the fact that it hasn't worked for many people at all. And so I like to focus on this idea of status envy, which I think is the big thing in society, that keeping up with the Joneses, as we know about. Because when it comes down to status envy and financial inequity, when you put those two things together, it's interesting to know that more than 80% of the world's population lives in countries where financial inequity is increasing. So you might be pulled out of poverty in terms of the World Bank categorization in China. You go over your $2 a day purchasing power parity, etc. And then all of a sudden, China's expanding in terms of its financial inequity, so the relative poverty kicks in. And that's what drives the aspiration and the increased consumption and the never-ending treadmill of production that's associated with that. Now, this unsustainability comes largely through the limits to growth stuff. Around the year I was born, 1982, the world, according to the Global Footprint Network, passed overshoot. That point where the amount that the Earth produces, that we use, actually starts reducing in terms of the actual capital. We start using more each year than the Earth can produce for us to replenish. And what I found particularly shocking was the 2005 United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that found that every living system in the biosphere, every living system was actually in a state of decline, and that the rate of decline was increasing. Now, just last week I got an email from a friend, Graham Turner, who's at the CSIRO. He was the one who in 2008 did the modelling to update the limits to growth stuff that the Club of Rome did back in the 70s. In 2008, he found they were on track in terms of their middle business as usual model. Last week, he's just found not only are they on track, but in fact, it's playing out as they modelled it in terms of the repercussions. Now, what few people remember about the Limits to Growth report was that there were actually 3 different tracks. So, of course, your naysayers got up and said, well, that track didn't happen, that was just all hoo-ha, a little bit like the population bomb stuff, it didn't happen, etc. But there were 3 tracks, and the middle one, this business as usual one, is the one that we're tracking on at the moment. And that predicts total systems collapse by 2050. Because this isn't just about carbon. This isn't just about carbon dioxide. This is about peak lots of things. And this is about peak social pressures too. Urbanisation, soil, phosphate, all sorts of things that go into the mix here. Now, the common thing that people respond to me about this is, well, there are lots of people doing wonderful things at this sustainability, innovation and society juncture. I just, about halfway through reading Richard Branson's Screw Business as Usual. It's rubbish. And it's not rubbish because the intention isn't great there. He's talking about some of the great models in terms of business combining with social good, more businesses focusing on mission-driven stuff. It's rubbish because for a man who is so intelligent, he has missed a really important ingredient in this, and that is financial inequity and status envy associated with that. Because the amount of people over the last 15 years who've approached me through various means and said, hey, do you know Richard Branson, or how do I get in touch with Richard Branson? I ask them what they're wanting to get in touch with him for, and it's not a social or mission-driven organisation. It's their latest for-profit initiative, which is essentially something that I would say is screwing the planet. And the issue behind this, and the issue that I have with so many of my friends who went into investment banking or into those law firms or set up their companies, etc., who then went and set up an orphanage in India. They were touched by something, and these are great people, really good intentioned people who I love. The challenge I have with that situation is that they miss this issue about the privatisation of profits. Because for mine, it's not complicated to see that if you're working for a big bank here that's creating financial inequity, making rich people richer, and if you then understand that that inequality drives the increases in consumption, the aspirations, etc., and often drives unsustainable practices, and then you set up your projects over here with your social good kind of avenue, then in fact all you're really doing is trying to put a band-aid on something that you're actually perpetuating with your day job. Now that's a really hard reality for lots of people to face, because then they'll say, no, but I'm looking at shared value. I'm looking at new models that actually merge community and society and innovation and environment and business together, you know? Profits, people, planet, those three things can coexist. Not if they're private profits, they can't, I say. It just doesn't add up. You can't have increasing financial inequity. You can't tax to a point and have enough philanthropy for those three things to reconcile with each other. It just doesn't work, because you would lose all incentive to innovate within that model. But you can do it within a not-for-profit model, is my argument. Sticking with this, though, for a little bit longer, one of the great examples that's put forward by people, and I think there's so many good aspects to this, is Ray Anderson, the late Ray Anderson, and in Interface. You know, a man who had an epiphany about his business, his for-profit business in the carpet space, and said, hey, you know what? We're going to shift this around. We're going to try to become a, what did he call it? He said, Mission Zero. Our promise to eliminate any negative impact our company may have on the environment by 2020. And what have they done? Wonderful things. They've cut their greenhouse gas emissions by 82%. They've cut fossil fuel consumption by 60%. They've cut waste by 66%. Keeping in mind, this is a carpet company. Tough things to do here. They've cut water use by 75%. So this is someone who the business community sees as a radical, who comes out and says, he said, there'll be a point in history in the future where all of us will be, us type of people will be put in jail. He's radical in the business community, and he's been doing these amazing things. Yet then, two other things that he includes in his greatest achievements. Invented and patented new machines, materials and manufacturing processes, increased sales by 66%, doubled earnings and raised profit margins. That's what everyone in the social, the shared value, the for-benefit corporation stuff loves to hear, right? Those things are like all tick the boxes. That's just a perfect social business. I'm here to tell you I don't think it is. If it's still increasing profits to shareholders, in my books, that's driving inequity, financial inequity. That's driving status envy, and that's driving increases in consumption that, given we're in overshoot, don't add up. It's not to say there aren't brilliant aspects of that. If Interface were a not-for-profit, I'd be saying that's wonderful. But it would also probably have an opening up of its model in terms of it wouldn't be patenting within that not-for-profit, I suspect. It wouldn't be looking at returning any money to shareholders because it couldn't. And so I think there are the things there to consider, and particularly in that light as well, thinking about limits to innovation. So people commonly say as well, we can innovate our way out of this. You know, we're very good, especially when they're typically tending towards the thought around scientific innovation when they say that, is what my experience has been. But as Tim Jackson, the person who wrote Prosperity Without Growth out of the UK, has said, you would actually need to innovate so damn fast in terms of dealing with just the carbon issue itself. You'd actually have to decarbonise through innovation at 11% per year, which is 16 times faster than we've been doing since 1990. Now, I spent 8 years looking all around the world at nanotechnology, cutting-edge innovation. I didn't find anything with any serious credibility that suggests to me, as a non-scientist, I must say, that suggests to me that we can innovate our way out of these issues. Nothing. Don't take it from me, though. See what you've heard, see what you've found around the place that proves perhaps that we can innovate our way out of this. Not to say there aren't plenty of wonderful things that we could pick up tomorrow, many of them more appropriate tech, perhaps at the low-tech end of scale, to innovate in relation to this. It's just to say, I don't think that that's worth putting our eggs in that basket in particular. I think we should be continuing to innovate, look for environmental efficiencies where possible, etc., but not to fall into the trap of that scientific reductionism that comes with that I would argue is actually linked in as well, that atomistic thinking, which is linked in with this idea of profit maximisation to private individuals. And there's another aspect here worth touching on too, which is Jevons paradox. That's that one, I mean, I remember the thought of the paperless office that got put out there. What happened to that one? You know, all those studies that are now showing that we shift to biofuel cars or hybrid cars, and we just buy more cars overall. And so Jevons paradox says that throughout history, in terms of industrialised history, the gains made by increases in energy efficiency are outstripped by overall increases in consumption. And that's an interesting one to think of in terms of the actual realities of our situation here. Does that sit true for you? And with that one, often you find spin that's associated with this. This one was just a classic. I was on a flight back from a small country town a few years ago, and there was an article in the magazine from the company there called A Lighter Footprint. It said, congratulations, you've just helped save the Earth from 6,000 to 8,000 tonnes of CO2. The Q400 turboprop produces 30 to 40% less emissions, which means that every Q400 aircraft can produce 6,000 to 8,000 fewer tonnes of CO2 every year. So simply by flying the Q400 airliner, you're helping to reduce your environmental impact. And all you had to do was sit back and enjoy the flight. Sadly, that's how we're conning ourselves every single day. That's what marketing companies get paid to do when they're working with for-profits. And my last point then in that respect is that I think there is a corporate social responsibility ceiling. And it's perhaps a strange example to bring in here because it's not quite linked to the for-profit, not-for-profit model, but I think of Lance Armstrong. Now, good old Lance, the evidence is in, it seems, and yet this is a man who's raised $500 million for cancer through his charity, Live Strong. And we know that cancer is a big heartstring. It's an important issue. It affects so many of us. So many of Lance's supporters aren't deserting him. I've been reading this everywhere because of his charity work. And I use this as an example to highlight how if in the future, as we already have now, but if in the future it expands, you've got a for-profit business which is screwing over the planet, and it's got a not-for-profit on the side foundation which is doing great work, that they'll spin it to the point that you won't be able to point your finger easily, or you won't want to, or you just won't point your finger easily at the for-profit because you love what they're doing in the not-for-profit space. That's the danger of the corporate social responsibility ceiling, is that they get too good at selling the heart stuff and that they become basically uncritiquable and that we lose our way. So how is it happening that we're shifting to not-for-profit model? Well, I said I think there's some inevitabilities around there. I've certainly seen around the world the not-for-profit model expanding as people start to understand, wow, I can run a business, a thriving business, and in fact I can have a competitive advantage in countries like Australia running that business within the not-for-profit model. The 100 groups I've worked with through Project Australia, probably about 50 of them didn't realise that social enterprise avenue was open to them as a not-for-profit, and that's exciting. I've also seen a lot of relocalising of economies around the world. We're seeing that particularly in the food and agricultural space, but also in health and other areas, education, place-based learning, those sorts of things. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm interested in simple stuff with profound simplicity. And something that struck me as profoundly simple recently was thinking about how you intersect internet with economic development in local areas. So imagine, for example, and think perhaps of the US as well as we go through this. Imagine in Australia, the Australian government turned around and said, over the next year, we are going to run a process of mapping local community assets, be they physical assets or the people within them, to be able to put up as user-generated content, which is now something that's very easy to do, their passions, knowledge, skills, resources. I'm currently running a project in my small town on a river an hour north of Sydney, creating a community directory of just those things. Almost 400 things have been put in voluntarily. Wonderful things from people lending out their boats through to skills that people have in terms of woodwork, mechanics, people who want to catch up around bird watching, etc., etc. The internet, I argue, offers new platforms, as we've seen through collaborative consumption, to relocalise economies by simply mapping assets. Even if just 2% of the Australian economy picked up that idea and put up content about themselves and you had enough critical mass in small areas, I argue that you could relocalise economic growth to the point that it would actually be local economic growth, given the ridiculous amount of distance people often travel for service provision or to have basic needs fulfilled, whether that's companionship or happiness related, etc. So I think you could actually shrink an economy in terms of its GDP, increase it locally, shrink the overall GDP perhaps as a national measure, while simultaneously increasing service provision just by using the power of the internet. And that's where I say this stuff is great, because it actually, if you think about that big divide in the US politically between left and right, where people say, well, you know, if we're going to, we need to shrink government down in size, and we need to hand back to the private sector in terms of provision of services, or the creation, you know, the development of the market, versus we need a bigger government and service provision. Not-for-profit enterprise and localisation of economies and asset mapping, etc., actually plays into both of those camps, because you can decrease bureaucracies whilst increasing service provision at the same time. It just doesn't happen within the private model. Some other things that are happening that I think are particularly exciting in this space is you've got people like Peter Victor at York University, who modelled for the first time on a macroeconomic level, or for the economy of Canada, a low growth model. And what he's shown in that modelling is that you could actually have high employment, a sustainable economy in terms of waste, etc., without growth. You can see his work in his book, Managing Without Growth. They use a carbon taxation and work time reduction as a means for that. I'm also, as I mentioned, working with a number of people, potentially people in this audience too, if you're interested, on the model that I've put forward tonight a little bit. How do the actual macroeconomics of this work? Tough questions around things like devolving the share market, etc., over time, but thinking about it in terms of incentives for business to actually do that. And I think there's some interesting angles to explore there. If you're running a company and you've had your initial float 30, 40, 50 years ago, and you've got, for example, a good line of credit with banks, etc., do you actually need to be leaching out 4% of your income annually to shareholders? Or does it actually make sense over 40 or 50 years to actually buy back the company, as happens often, you know, as a buyback in the US, for example, or a buyback of shares here, but to take the company private. But in doing so, not take it private, but take it to a point where those shares go back in trust and shift to not-for-profit, so you never have to pay out dividends to anyone. Does that make actual good business sense in terms of long-term sustainability of companies? And there are some unstoppable things that are happening around the world in terms of trends that I think support, on a very basic level, some of the ideas that I'm putting forward tonight. So you've got the reintroduction of gross national happiness as a different kind of indicator. The UK has adopted this nationally in terms of different indicators of well-being. The state of Vermont, where I was recently, is putting forward legislation around this. The US Department of Health is now looking at a different national indicator beyond GDP. And of course, this came out of Bhutan, where they don't use GDP as an indicator of happiness, and every 2 years the public votes on what they'd like to include within that happiness measure. So interesting stuff that's happening there. You've got the law of the rights of Mother Earth that came out of Bolivia in the last little while, where for the first time ever, and same in Ecuador, the first time ever, the rights of nature were actually enshrined into law that has real implications in terms of development and infrastructural development in particular. You've got the return of the gift economy that I'm seeing all around the world, freeganism. In Mali, for example, there's still a thriving gift culture where people don't actually barter and trade so much as actually just gift. Islamic banking is one that I'm hearing more about in terms of Qard al-Hassan, the principle of non-interest loans that has equity measures built in terms of investors actually buying into the company for a limited while in the process. Peer-to-peer production, as I mentioned, and transition towns. Just to name just a few examples, now over 1,000 transition towns around the world, people looking at creating energy descent action plans for their local communities. It's exciting stuff. And I think the last thing I want to say is around why there's real hope in this space. And that's because imagine there was a seriously strong correlation between wealth and happiness beyond that point of a certain point in economies. Imagine the wealthier you got, the happier you just continue to get. Thank God that isn't the case. I mean, then I think we'd be in real trouble. But the fact that it isn't that way is really exciting, because it means that as people get real with themselves and ask about purpose, often happens for men in their 50s, that legacy stuff where they go, what have I done with my life? But as it happens more and people talk about it more, the blinkers can come off and people can be more receptive to this sort of stuff. And I want to end just with that lovely story that many of you may know about Joseph Heller, when he was at that party put on by the hedge fund manager. And his friend came up. This is Joseph Heller of Catch-22, the book. And his friend comes up and says, Joseph, you must be so depressed. This guy earns more in a day than you've earned throughout the whole lifetime of your book. And Joseph says, you know what? I'm not. Because I've got something that he'll never have. Enough. And that's probably enough from me. Thanks.